Thank you very much for taking the time to join the presentation this evening. And I hope you've already got some great value out of the talks and the tracks and the many experts that have joined Digileaders this year. So across the next half an hour, the intention is I'm going to take you through a few ideas, thoughts, insights, and otherwise around the sometimes complex, sometimes thorny subject of change, based a little bit on the experience that I've had and some of the the conclusions that I've reached and how I now approach those things. So in broad order, this is the intention tonight. We're going to take a quick look at change, and I'm going to suggest a definition for the kind of change that we're working with, a little bit about failures, not too much about that, and then move into some focuses which I think can help you, or at least there's certainly things that I choose to focus on when I'm working with customers that help change move. After approximately half an hour, we've got then certainly another 15 minutes after that for Q&A if people have got time. Just very briefly to explain that for a second, if you've not used this particular platform before, on the right-hand side of the screen, if you've already got the bar available, you can probably see an ask a question option. If not, there's a little icon at the top of the screen there that's, when you hover over it, will say Q&A, the thing that looks like a little discussion. If you click on that, it'll open the window and then you're able to ask questions, which then I'll come back to at the end. We're not able to interact, but at least I can read the questions that you send across, and I'll be able to answer as many of those as I can towards the end of the session. Very briefly, because we're not here to talk about me at all, just to give you a sense, my name's Stephen Morris, for those people that I've not yet had the chance to meet. I'm a consultant, coach, trainer, thinking partner, as you wish, working with organizations to help them achieve outcomes, whether that relates to agile, IT, other kinds of change, after a long background in IT. The main reason for sharing this is I think that background has allowed me to make enough mistakes that hopefully I can share a little bit of insight with you about the kind of things that now work for me. So let's get straight into the conversation for tonight. First of all, if we talk about the statistics on change, all of us will probably have quite a familiar picture, or at least if you pick up a copy of the any of the kind of IT press or trade press, we'll see things like this. For the number of changes that start, a limited number of those changes finish. So whether it be Forbes or Kotter or whomever, we talk about subjects, or we talk about 30%, let's imagine, of change programs being successful, as Kotter in the bottom right-hand corner would say. Further on in those articles, there are often descriptions of why that might be, and Kotter list their 10 reasons, as do McKinsey at the front, calling out the employees are resistant to change. We won't particularly go into depth in here on that point, but I will provide a link at the end to some resources that you can download, which I kind of dispute that point, I would say. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Overall, and within the center of all of these reasons that there could be, because there are many in any given situation, the position I've got to is broadly we, the organizations we work with, miss the complexity. And by miss, it may be a natural unknown unknowns, I didn't see it, or it could be underestimation. It could be we choose to ignore the fact that the situation, or avoid the situation. I'll try and explain myself a bit more as we go through the session. So first of all, let's talk about what change is. Change, I suppose, can have a number of definitions, but if we start with a very simple thing here, we could describe this as being change. We're taking a sheet of paper and simply turning that sheet of paper into an aeroplane. There's a known process for it, a known set of steps. It's a very simple process. If we increase the complexity or increase the number of moving parts here, we could maybe look at this, which is the MAVEN satellite, launched from Earth to a stable orbit around Mars over a period of 11 months, approximately, the journey took to achieve the stable orbit. Now, we're following a set of known calculations here, or rather, this is a very calculated change. It took a long time, and it's more complicated than our aeroplane. But I would suggest that most of the kind of change that we deal with is this kind of thing, where we've got England trying to eradicate smoking by the end of 2030, for example. So given that the first biological link between smoking and cancer was identified in 1954, we're more than 75 years later, if we assume that we reach this target. But this is much more the kind of change that I think we're grappling with. Our paper aeroplanes and our satellite changes, perhaps the statistics are slightly better. This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. So A definition, or at least the first part of a definition, a change, or at least a change that I'm talking about here this evening, is something that causes or necessitates a shift in human behavior. And it's that human bit that's the part that we often underestimate. An easy way to, or I say an easy way, a way that I use to help people understand just kind of what I'm talking about here is with a picture. So just a little bit of a viewer warning, if you're of any kind of nervous disposition or otherwise. This isn't a horrible picture as such, but you may have a reaction to it. So just a small warning, I'll tell you when the next screen arrives. But for those people that are sticking with me, I'd like you to just take a look at this picture for 10 seconds and then I'll come back on. Okay, we're safe again to look. For anybody that wasn't watching that, I was just showing a picture of a man hanging by his fingertips for pleasure to the top of a building, very, very, very high up. Now, the reason I show you that is, and we don't have time in this conversation this evening to go into the neuroscience or kind of what's behind this, but many of us are at least familiar with the idea that we have different parts to our brain. This is Paul MacLean's triune brain model here that I'm describing. And we know that some of the earlier parts of our brains worry about things like our safety and our survival. So when I've shown this picture to teams, often people in the room, myself very much included, will have a physical reaction to that picture. So maybe my palms get a bit sweaty, maybe my heart rate increases, which is all a kind of an autonomic older part of my brain response to what's been going on. Why am I talking about this in terms of change? Well, if you imagine for a second that if this worked on you, I could provide a physical response to you by showing you a picture. What's it now like if I'm going to radically change the way that an organization is structured and is working when people have been working in that way for 10, 15, 30 years, whatever it might be? The level of complexity we're now talking about of what's going on in people's minds is obviously very large. A very practical example of this that I can give you was from a couple of years ago working with an organization where we were rolling out or helping them with major incident management practices. The team weren't doing particularly well, or at least wanted to increase their performance. So we defined or set up some new practices to improve the performance of incident management. One of the people that technically understood this very well, though, wasn't applying the new approaches. And after a number of conversations, this sentence that I'm sharing here, this is broadly what we found out, that the reason why he wasn't applying the practices was there was a block for him of being worried about what other people might think about him if he tried the new practices and then was less successful. This is not the sort of thing that we often, when we set out to start change, we don't expect. Maybe we've got experience of things like this, but we certainly don't see things like this in a plan. So that's what I'm talking about human behavior, just a brief glimpse into some of the complexity of what's happening here. The second point, and the thing that makes this even harder in terms of change, is just a very familiar idea that if we're trying to, for example, here land an aeroplane on an aircraft carrier, we know that both of these things have velocity, whether both of them are moving at the same time. So in order for the plane to land, it will need to make adjustments along the way. This, of course, is what's happening in our environments around us. And I just, for the sake of it, I'll put lots of arrows on the screen to kind of illustrate this. We have change in technology, change in working practices. I'll talk a little bit about an example related to COVID a bit later. Change is happening all the time. So while our aircraft carrier might be quite a predictable thing in a sense to be able to land our aircraft on, the organizations we're landing change into keep moving. So a little twist to my definition of a change then is to say it involves a shift in human behavior, yes, but it happens in environments that are already changing. And from that point, I get to the conclusion, for me at least, that the reason why the formulas have never quite worked for me is because they don't apply. So we can't rely on a formula, or at least wholly rely on a formula anywhere. So what I'm going to talk about in the the second half of this conversation, is 5 areas that I particularly focus on to try and help navigate this position. And the first of those is around evolving purpose and outcomes. So very simply, if I just put this on a screen for a second, back to our paper aeroplane, many of us are already going to be familiar with the idea of engaging teams with some kind of purpose. We want to go somewhere, and absolutely, and I will always support people doing that. I'd like us to go a little bit further though in this, and the more I work with teams, the more I understand this, that just a purpose on a wall, or rather just an articulation of what a future might be, doesn't necessarily help people orient to that change. Let's talk instead a little bit more about outcomes. By talking about outcomes and specifically measurable outcomes, so we understand what results we're expecting to see, what kind of behaviors we're expecting to see, and get quite specific, it allows people to kind of, let's say, orient and organize themselves much better. The second part of that sentence, though, is about current purpose. And maybe this relates back to my aircraft carrier example a second ago, which is to say we should, in the very first place, consider that our purpose and our outcomes will evolve. So we should leave space for different things, or rather better outcomes perhaps, as we progress. Let's take an example. I mentioned agile earlier. Let's take a favorite example of an organization trying to become agile, and that's their purpose. That's the thing that they're trying to do, and many organizations I've seen try to do this. In that case, we might see this kind of thing. We might see people implementing scrums, some stand-ups happening. We may even see some behavioral things like more collaboration. Let's imagine structural changes. The question that I would want to ask, though, is, so what here? Or a slightly kinder question, borrowed from clean language here, and when you become agile, then what happens? What we're probing for in there is something that we can actually hang our hat on. So for agility, for example, there are many outcomes that we might be seeking here. It may relate to quality, to efficiency, whatever that might be. But by getting us to this side of the screen, it allows people to act and align with and be more autonomous in terms of the change. I mentioned COVID earlier. The example I had related to a desktop services team. So this desktop, if we imagine desktop support, this is not normally a headline organizer or part of an organization. But during COVID, the team were asked, like many of us were, to do what they could to help keep the lights on effectively, or maintain service. Being clear about what maintain service meant and being given the space to do that, this is the kind of feedback that the team received. Not thanks for fixing my laptop, but much more, we've got feedback to a service desk team here about adaptation, about creativity, ideas, about new ways of working. That's all come out of this kind of position. It's amazing what happens when we give teams some clarity of their outcomes. So the first one, or the first focus here, please keep an evolving view of purpose and go further than purpose into some specific outcomes that people can work with. The second thing that I'll focus on when I work with organizations is energy or motivation. And perhaps a familiar picture, stick with agile for a second. On the 1st of January, we say we would like to be agile, and then someone on the 31st of December wonders why we're not. Of course, in the middle, we were all busy doing important stuff, and there are many short-term urgent actions, of course, that might be triggered and people might need to get involved in. That's fair enough. I'd just like to complement this with a couple of familiar ideas, perhaps to many of you. The first is simply the diffusion of innovations. So we normally talk about this in terms of technology adoption or product adoption, where we have our innovators on the left-hand side here, the small number of people that will jump straight in with a new unproven technology, through to the people on the right-hand side who will finally and only reluctantly move towards a technology, typically when everyone else has. If we apply this to change, we see the same thing. Most agile implementations or agile changes in organizations, you will see a nucleus of people that jump straight in. They love the idea, they get it, they want to play and discover what it can mean for the company. But then we see this curve happening. If we take that as a counterpoint, though, and we add this concept in, which is rather depressing for me and anyone else that's presenting, that 40% of everything I say this evening is going to be lost within 20 minutes of us speaking, and within a month you would have pretty much forgotten everything I've said. So thankfully this is going on YouTube if you find any of this interesting. If we combine those two worlds, we've got a sense of we have to have attention over a period of time, and especially because people are losing what they learn. Just take maybe a very simple practical example of somebody trying to get fit or develop muscles. Let's imagine it doesn't just happen by saying so on the 1st of January. We have to put the work in. We have to repeat. We have to have the discipline. And we can't get away from this. There's some irony that we need an awful lot of discipline when organizations, I believe, especially when they're moving towards agile, for example, that it's all about letting people kind of flow. What we really need to do is be very clear about outcomes and keep reminding people about the value that's being generated, and then we've got a much better chance. One footnote on this, of course, if you are pushing very hard and reminding, just like imagine your fitness instructor giving you a hard time about how many laps you've done, you need to keep an eye on energy levels, because you can, if you push too hard, of course, burn people out. So those first two things, let's have a really clear purpose with some outcomes. It doesn't matter if that evolves over time, but then let's make sure that we continue to keep focus on it. The third thing that I will look at and help teams to look at is around the systems within their organization. So start with a quote from Deming, a very famous quote from Deming, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And of course, the large corporate, let's imagine that we're making this change in, is beautifully designed with millions of moving parts, relationships, and otherwise that achieve the results that it gets right now. Let me give you an example from working with an organization a few years ago, again, where let's stick with a service desk here, that were asked to, or rather the customers of the service desk wanted the team to fix more problems, i.e. when they phoned up, they really wanted someone to actually solve their problem rather than just be nice and not be able to help them, which unfortunately is a lot of what they received. When we had a look at what was going on around this team, though, it fairly quickly became obvious that the service desk team themselves were being measured to two targets at the same time. They were being measured on time to answer, so how quickly they picked the phone up, and also their first time fix times, so how many times they resolved a customer's inquiry or a customer's problem during the first phone call. If you haven't already noticed the contention here, in order to answer the phone very quickly, I need to get people off the phone very fast. I'll finish my calls quickly, but in order to fix things properly for people, I need to spend time with them. So what would you do as a service desk agent in this example? You do the best you can, and unfortunately one of the people even thought that this was intentional, that the company were trying to make it impossible for them to be successful. A couple of answers, of course. We can take a top-down or an organizational view here and say let's intervene and just be really, really clear. Back to my point about outcomes, it's not about the time to answer, it's about the first time fix, for example. I would argue a better and more sustainable answer here, though, is to actually coach and support and teach the teams what the outcomes are, and therefore give them the space, and we'll come back to a little bit of that later, to make their own decisions. We don't want people to not answer the phone at all, after all. We want them to prioritize or move towards first time fix. A very simple exercise you can do to help find these things. This actually comes from applied behavioral analysis, a tool used in psychology, but where, if we imagine this simple fulcrum here, on the left-hand side, we've got things that might inhibit change. So for my person earlier being frightened or nervous about the reaction of doing worse with the new process, that would very much sit on the left-hand side. And things that promote change might sit on the right-hand side. So that could be anything from my life gets a little bit easier, from personally I might receive some kudos for trying a new thing, etc., etc. It doesn't need to be physical or monetary rewards at all. We could talk about anything in here. By creating a bit of a picture, though, of what is preventing and what is promoting the change, or at least investigating and brainstorming and having a conversation about this, very obviously, if we've got less things that promote the change than things that are inhibiting it, it's very unlikely that people will move by their own choice. And in my experience, if you list both of these things and you find that effectively you've got a balance, nothing much is going to change either. If you're particularly trying to change behavior, we need to find a way to almost imbalance this intentionally and be very conscious about that. So we've got through three, we've got two more to go, or two more themes to go before we conclude and move into a little bit of Q&A if people do have questions. The fourth focus, so after going through so far, we've talked about purpose and outcomes, we've talked about keeping focus, and then we've talked about systems. The fourth is then experimenting, learning, and iterating. The question to kind of frame this is one of how, I would ask, how does an athlete improve? So what an athlete, I would argue, does not do is this. They begin their career in athletics, and they write a plan that says, this is how we're going to, or rather, this is how I'm going to make it. I'm going to try and train in a certain way, achieve a bronze medal. Different kinds of trainings will deliver different medals. I'll get some kind of TV deal, and then I'll retire. Of course, this sounds desperately impractical. What we're really going to see is this kind of thing. And the data in the center here is from a rowing data analysis site, rosenall.com. You'll see here, though, this is probably what you would expect when you speak to an athlete. You'd expect them to have a huge amount of data available to them about what their performance is. It would relate to what they've been eating, how they've been training, the feedback they're getting, their performance when compared to other athletes, their wins, their losses, and so on and so on and so on. This is a constant iteration and a constant learning as to we're slowly nudging and adapting our performance towards a position in the future. Bringing this back into the office for a second, one approach that I use more and more at the moment, I'm working with a number of companies with, relates to OKRs. And OKRs is something we're perhaps familiar with in terms of let's use that for our goals, but hang on a minute, isn't that what change is all about anyway? We're trying to deliver some goals. The reason I call out objectives and key results, though, is if we imagine that we've got our purpose and the overall aim on the wall, this iterative cycle of OKRs, where on a quarterly basis we can be really clear about what our outcomes are, what is it that's going to take us closer to that mission, closer to that future that we're imagining this quarter. There's then a period of check-ins, which covers some of the thing I talked about earlier about making sure that we maintain focus on what's happening. And then absolutely critically in here, we've got a review and a retrospective. The review being, have we actually delivered any value? Has a stakeholder benefited because of the work that we've done? And that gives us an opportunity to recalibrate and then choose again what we're going to do in the next quarter, let's imagine. The retrospective is there much more just like a retrospective in Scrum or in other techniques. This is about understanding or a chance to look at the system itself. Did the way we were working serve us to achieve the value that we wanted to for our customer or for our stakeholder? A clear example of this might actually be if we just look at Facebook for a second. Their approach to strategy, at least this, to my understanding, their approach to strategy is to have this kind of long-term vision and then almost nothing in between. They've got something far out, and then every 3 months they will plan and have a kind of short horizon in front of them. Google have got a mix of 3 months and 1 year, for example. Different organizations do different things, but all of them start with the assumption that everything's going to change. So why are we going to? There's no point in planning out too far. Let's have some shorter term outcomes and learn something as we go. The final piece that I wanted to talk about today in this conversation, the final is about safety. And I've seen a couple of the other speakers during Digileaders already mentioning psychological safety. There are many examples of, unfortunately, horrendous disasters and otherwise, where the cause of them, albeit there were some technical components, perhaps we can argue in places in many disasters, in these particular 4 that I describe here, the real cause after the investigation came down to either a fear of speaking up or a fear of consequences somewhere. So if we take United Airlines Flight 173 in the top left-hand corner here, this was a flight landing into Portland in Oregon, and on approach into the airport, as the landing gear came down, there was a noise or a vibration, and the light that would have confirmed that the landing gear was down didn't illuminate. So the crew, understandably, were concerned about this. It's safe, or it's safe enough anyway, to land a plane without the landing gear down. However, they had some time and they wanted to just check and see if they could diagnose the problem. So they went into a holding pattern. Unfortunately, what happened, they sat in the holding pattern investigating this for so long that the plane eventually ran out of fuel and ended up crashing in a far less controlled landing with the death of 10 people, including 2 of the crew. The thing that's fascinating about that, or the thing that's actually changed some of the aviation policy and otherwise since, related to the conversations that were going on in the cockpit, there was almost a reverence or a deferral to the lead to not be able to challenge the captain in the cockpit and the culture of not being able to challenge, which meant that there were phrases like 15 minutes is going to run us really low on fuel were in the transcript. So the person who was monitoring the fuel at no point said, or at no point seemed to say, land this plane now, we're going to run out of fuel, we're going to crash. Rather, it was hinting at it to the captain, waiting for somebody else to make the decision. The other things in here we've got similar stories about, and we don't have time, but all of these are available. Go to Wikipedia, you can find these rather tragic stories in all cases. This fear or consequence of speaking up. Again, bring that back to the person I was talking about earlier and my example. I'm not going to try the new process because it might make us look bad, so we're not going to do it. Given that we've set a clear goal, we've set some clear outcomes, i.e. we know where we're going, we're putting lots of pressure on to make, or rather we're putting lots of repetition into our program to help us get to a destination. We're solving impediments within the system and we want people to identify those. We need people to feel comfortable to speak up. So there is much on this, and Amy Edmondson, her original TED Talk, the books, research and otherwise that she's done goes into a lot more depth than I ever can in a single slide here. But broadly speaking, in an environment where we would see these things as not being safe, we see effectively a punitive response to speaking up, or an expectation that we're going to be 100% right all the time. If we just said that in order to approach these kind of complex change, we need to be changing all the time, of course, we're not going to be right all the time. So if we're expecting that everything's going to be correct, we're giving ourselves a disadvantage. On the other side, however, when we're talking about environments that are safe, we want people to be exploring. We want to celebrate good failure. We're not talking about malevolent action here, but when someone has genuinely tried something and it hasn't worked, that's great. We've learned something fantastic. Mistakes give us an opportunity to learn, and it's perfectly okay to challenge the status quo to anyone, anywhere. That's the kind of world that we finally want to kind of get to. So to summarize that finally into these few themes that are described here, I'm not trying to describe a process to you. That runs counter to what I said at the beginning. Rather, I'm trying to say that if you're involved in a change in an organization, or you're helping an organization with change, these are the things that help me to make progress. So whether that be evolving purpose or enabling systems, these are the things that I'll look at. Very intentionally in this last diagram I've given you here, though, these aren't balanced. Because in one organization or 1 month, 1 quarter, it might be one picture, but then in a following quarter, it may be in a different space. But these are the 5 themes that I keep in mind. And by experimenting and trying things across these, there's an opportunity, hopefully, to get us somewhere closer to valuable outcomes for the organizations that we're working with. So thank you very much for your attention through this presentation. As I said, there was a fairly fast half an hour through some concepts in change. I would invite you to download a copy of a PDF, or it's an ebook. I never know quite what the right term is, but a book that goes into some more detail about some of the concepts we talked in here, especially some of the neuroscience and what's going on in people's heads. If the part that I was talking about earlier about different parts of the brain, and also that thing about applied behavioral analysis and how balancing behavior might work, as well as some exercises and things, some of that content is in that downloadable book for you to be able to take away. The last thing I was going to say here before I kind of move away to a different screen and just see if there are any questions is my contact details are on the left hand side of that page. Please do feel free to reach out, connect to me on LinkedIn, say hello. I'd love to hear what you thought about tonight's conversation, whether or not you agree with anything that I've said or vehemently disagree. It would be wonderful to be able to have a conversation with you. So I'm going to stop presenting this screen now and just come back to the main screen and then see if there are any questions that have come up during the course of the conversation. Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions in here. The first one is, should continuous change be top down or bottom up, and does it matter? It's a great question. For me, I think it truly has to be both and all of the time. Let me just give you a little bit of an illustration, because that's a bit of an easy answer. If I come back to Agile, which I've talked about a few times in this conversation this evening, there's a temptation in agile transformation that we believe that we want to extinguish and remove all of the command and control type behavior in our company. Okay, so we don't want people to tell you what to do all day. That maybe makes sense. But what we often see is the leadership teams and the leaders themselves, therefore, stepping back from their teams. Unfortunately, when they do that, they step back perhaps too far, or to a position where the teams aren't able to organize themselves, don't quite have the context or don't have the depth of experience to be able to do something, and we end up losing out. The leaders get frustrated because the teams don't perform. The teams get frustrated because they've lost their help and their context. So truly, it's a partnership, I would say. In an organization, different people exist at different levels, or rather have different perspectives in organizations, and we want to be able to harness that. If the commercial part of an organization has a very clear and definite view about our commercial position, competitive disadvantage or advantage in the marketplace, then we have to bring that in. But we also have to believe, or rather we have to make sure that our teams understand the context they're working into, so they can influence activity and influence change at every level in the organization at the same time. Having some kind of unified set of outcomes, I guess, is where I'm kind of getting to, where that's a transparent thing that we're all working to at the same time. Second question, I've got another question in here around transformational or transactional, or a mix of both. So unfortunately, because this is a broadcast thing, I may not be able to ask you a question in here. So I'll have a go at answering this, and hopefully I've got it in the right way. If you in the question you're trying to make a distinction between two different types of change, i.e. a truly transformational change and activity that's happening, or change in tactical activity within an organization, I would suggest that all of this applies in both cases. The thing that's different, I suppose, between the two is the scale, and perhaps back to the previous question as well, how far or how far-reaching, how many people within our organization need to understand and share a similar set of outcomes and an awareness. So if we imagine that we've got a particular team, then we're trying to adopt a new way of onboarding customers into our organization, then the kind of themes that I've been talking so far about in this talk can be applied at a very transactional level, and we can move on. If we're trying to do something, though, that's much more, let's imagine a large digital transformation, let's just be really clear about what we mean by that large digital transformation, come back to my point about outcomes, and then from that point we can apply and balance some of the things that I've been talking about so far. So, sincere apologies to that second question if, because of the format here, I haven't quite understood what you meant. So please do come back if there was, if you've got any further questions, or connect to me afterwards, and I'll be very pleased to have a conversation about it. Oh, and I've got one last question in here. What would you say is the single greatest barrier to overcome in organizations that are seeking agile transformation? That's a really good question. Honestly, can I have two, Carl, if I may? The first one, just because I think one of them I mentioned in here anyway, which is why they've done it. It does sadden me when, if you're working in an organization, or rather you're helping an organization, you want to become agile, and nobody can tell you why they've done it, or at least the reasons that seem to turn up don't really have any teeth. And it finally looks like somebody read a book somewhere and said, yep, let's give this a try. Maybe if they were honest with you, that's great. But so the first reason is just knowing why. The second for me really comes down to the leaders and the kind of the structural elements of the organization not understanding what it is that they do in this new world. And there are so many models out there. You look at the big leadership models, leadership circle profiles. We've got stuff that comes out of some of the big consultancies, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we tell our leaders that they've got to go off and be catalysts, and they've got to coach their teams and do all of this stuff. Great, as long as they've got the skills to do that. But what do I actually have to do this afternoon? What's going to make a difference to me right now? I think that's where one of the greatest barriers is, at least That's one I see. If you give teams enough context and enough space, they normally do fine. The middle management who sit in an organization, actually the whole of the leadership chain, not understanding what their responsibility is here is definitely my single, that would be my greatest barrier, I think. A long answer, Carl, but it would be difficult to say that it's always one thing because it depends slightly on the organization, but they're probably my most common two. Okay, just give it a moment to see if there are any other final questions, and then we'll wrap up. A very big thank you to everybody for joining this evening. I'm really grateful for you for coming on tonight. And as my moderator has just said, thank you everybody, and please do get in touch if you'd like to discuss any of the things that I've been talking about further. Be delighted to speak to you. Just reach out on LinkedIn. A copy of this video will be up on the Digileaders website once very quickly. Hopefully we'll get that published across to them this evening, so it should be there in the next couple of days, and you'll be able to get a copy if you just write to me anyway. I'll point you to the YouTube link. Thank you all. I wish you a very wonderful evening and all the very best, and thank you again for joining. Bye-bye.